Hi, my name is Alan Gibson. Thank you very much for coming to this Society of Skeptics. Dr. Miller has been running this for a very long time, and I've gotten to know him over the years. And he found out that I was interested in cycling, and I am fortunate enough to be friends and actually ride with this gentleman to my right, whose name is Mr. George Hincapie. George Hincapie rode for a number of different teams. I did 17 Tour de France's, I think 17 Paris-Roubaix, and has been a professional cyclist for many, many years, and is also someone that I count as a close friend and has been kind of a trainer for me for the last couple of years. We're going to show a little clip about the Tour de France to begin with. This will show you some of the aspects that I love about cycling, and what I'm hoping to hear from George tonight are the aspects of cycling that one would want to attain if you wanted to be a professional cyclist, and if that was in the cards for you, he might be able to talk about what's required for that to occur. So with that, here's the trailer.
There's no other sporting event on an annual basis that matches up to the Tour de France as an achievement.
For the cyclist, it's like 3 weeks of pain, unbelievable concentration.
It's so hard and so demanding. It's the pinnacle of the sport.
Tour de France is for sure the biggest cycling event ever. Some situations are quite dangerous because not everybody knows how fast we go through or how dangerous it really is.
I have seen grown journalists in tears because of trying to get going down the mountains.
You go out riding your bike for 7 hours, 7 hours, 7 hours. It's raining, it might snow. I think suffering in cycling is basically the key to success.
You look at the mountains, you climb 3 of them in a day, each of them being 20 miles high, and you ride for 5 or 6 hours, then you repeat it next day, and the next, and the next. The challenges are immense just to complete the route.
Everybody knows firsthand how much suffering it requires to just survive the tour.
No, I'm good up there. Trust me, when I see you guys moving up, know what it's like. So stay together. Today you don't have the radios, you really have to fight to stay together.
So I sat the guys down in the Boston Marathon and said, please guys, I can do this, but I need every single one of you.
Sprinters have to be an extroverted character. They're like boxers. You've got to get in there and say, I'm going to win. I want to kill this guy. I want to knock him to the ground. And that's what a sprinter has to do.
For the moment, it's definitely come up here. Once again, 4 kilometres have taken this race, and they are showing the others how to lead out a sprint.
Okay, wow.
Got a little hot watching that.
Yeah, so that's what this guy lived several hundred days of your life, right?
Yep, 19 years as a professional cyclist.
Wow. How did you originally get involved in cycling?
So I grew up not far from here, down the road in Queens, New York, and my dad was an immigrant from Colombia, South America, and he grew up riding bikes and kind of made it the family sport for us. I really had no choice growing up, but I quickly learned to love it and became quite serious. Well, I started racing when I was about 10 years old, and already by 14, 15, I was racing in Europe and going away for months at a time to race in Europe and racing against the best in the world as a junior, and then making my first Olympic team at 18 years old and signing my first pro contract at 19, and that's pretty much all I've done since then.
Who was the first pro contract with?
Motorola.
So that would have been early 90s?
94 was my first pro year.
First pro year.
Yep.
Interesting. How many different teams over the course of your career?
I was on 4 different teams: Motorola, U.S. Postal Service, HTC, which is on that movie you just saw, and then BMC.
So the trailer that we just saw was 2009 Tour de France?
2009, correct.
Okay. And you were at that time working, this basically leads into the next question. So teams in cycling, tell me a little bit about how that works, what your role in the team is, how that, the iterations of a team structure.
So it's very similar to most team sports in the sense that, the best guys don't always necessarily make up the best teams. It's how the personalities and the characters all interact with each other, like companies, very similar to companies as well. So I've been on 4 teams my whole career, all American teams. So I was lucky in the sense that I never really had a cultural issue adapting to my teams, but I was very fortunate that I came across some great personalities. And like I said earlier, I wasn't always on teams with the best riders in the world, but we were on very successful teams because we all got along really well and we all knew our place in the team and knew what our job was on any given day.
So when you say place in the team and job on a team, what does that actually mean? What are the jobs that actually are part of it?
So in a race like the Tour de France, you have 9-man teams. Now they've changed it to 8-man teams, but back when I was racing it was 9-man teams. You have 1 or 2 leaders. Like on the HTC team, we had Mark Cavendish, who was a sprinter. So my role was to get him to 500 meters or a kilometer to 1,000 meters before the finish line, out of trouble, get him there safely, out of trouble, and in the front, which sounds a lot easier than it actually is. But that's what I would do on many stages of the Tour de France. And then we also had a free role in that team where we were able to go for breakaways and try to get stage wins. And that year I missed getting the yellow jersey by 5 seconds in my wife's hometown, so that was kind of a tough day for me. But so I had freedom to try not only helping Mark Cavendish out, but to go for my own victories or breakaways throughout the race.
So you worked as principally what they call in cycling the domestique, right?
Correct. Domestique.
So any given team would have 2 or 3 or 4 different domestiques all working in collaboration over the course of any stage race that could be 80 to 150 miles.
Yeah.
In support of that captain or that team leader that presumably would be the guy that can get over the line, provided you allowed him to draft on you and you took him around.
Correct. Well, some teams just have a bunch of guys that have the possibilities of winning the stage, and then every day they have a free card to go in the breakaway or to go for sprints. But that's more kind of like a lottery, so to speak. They'll win on occasion, but they're not the favorites, or they're not ever expected to win.
So you completed how many tours? 17, right?
16 and a half. My first one I didn't complete. I didn't finish my first one.
And upon how many teams were you on in which the tour was won?
Nine teams.
So
Yep.
9 teams actually that won the tour. Did you ride so tell us about racing in general. I mean, European racing. So there are spring classics and grand tours. Give us a quick breakdown of what that is.
So in the U.S., Tour de France is obviously the most popular. That's where most of the Americans watch that, and most of the Americans are into cycling for the month of July. But there's a lot of other races throughout the year. The spring classics, the Tour of Flanders, Paris-Roubaix, which are one-day races. They're usually very long, very intense.
Those are like 160
They're
miles.
160 miles, yeah, for one day, but usually very dangerous. You race on small roads. Positioning is a huge factor in your success. If you're able to maneuver yourself in a peloton of 200 guys that are racing on roads the size of this platform. So obviously if you enter those roads in the front, you have a much better shot of winning than entering in the last position, and you have many roads that are this size. So the whole day is about your sense of awareness of where you are in the bunch and what's coming up, which way the wind is coming. You race over cobblestone, so it's only one day, but it's a very, very intense and dangerous format of racing.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I love the grand stages, and so there's the Giro d'Italia, which is the Italian one that happens in late May, early June. Then the Tour de France is the marquee cycling race, and then the Volta a España, which happens in August in Spain. Obviously the marquee race is Tour de France, but when it comes to people who have, and races that I have more respect than anything in the world, completion of 17 Paris-Roubaix to me is probably That's a landmark achievement. I mean, tell
Well,
me
I'll-
about Paris-Roubaix a little bit.
Paris-Roubaix was a race that I grew up reading about when I was growing up. You couldn't really watch cycling in the U.S., but you could read about it a lot. And I raced in Central Park and Prospect Park with a lot of European and South Americans who only talked about races like Paris-Roubaix and Tour of Flanders. So my first Paris-Roubaix, I did it, and it was 35 degrees and snowing, but I was super excited to start it, just to be there. And I remember I think out of 210 people, like 40 people finished the race, and these are the best cyclists in the world, and I finished probably
210 started, 40 finished.
40 finished, because it was snowing. It was about as extreme conditions as you can get, but I was just so happy to be there that I was not going to quit no matter what. So I ended up getting like 30th place, but that day I said I wanted to win that race one day, or be very successful at it. And my whole career kind of was defined by races like Paris-Roubaix.
Yeah, so 160 miles. I mean, what I've always enjoyed about that race is it seems like they drop the flag, there's a little neutral, and then it's full gas.
Yeah, it's like I said,
160
super intense.
miles later, yeah.
160 miles later, 7 hours, sometimes 7.5 hours. That's not my phone, by the way.
Yeah, that's mine. So you did 70 Paris-Roubaix, Spring Classic. So talk to me about typical season in terms of training.
So we would start at a training camp, which Alan attended my team's training camp this year in January. Usually it would be in Europe somewhere, where the whole team would get together, which is rare for that throughout the year, because the team is usually 25 riders, but the races are only 8 to 9 riders. So you run split programs, sometimes three different programs throughout the same time period. So sometimes you don't even see your teammates for the whole year, except for training camp. So training camp is really important to meet all your teammates, meet all the new staff, meet your trainers, your coaches, get your workouts for the season, test your fitness, and then from there you get sent to the first races of the year, which are typically in southern Spain, to build up for the spring classics, races like Roubaix and Tour of Flanders, which are in April. Then usually I would come back home, take a break, and then head back over in June and get ready for the Tour de France.
So that period in the beginning of the camps and so forth, December, January, and what have you, that's in our world they call that base building, right?
Yeah, base miles. I mean, nowadays it's become so competitive, and so every race is so important that most guys don't even really take a break anymore. They'll take 2 weeks off in October, and then November they're back at it training, and everything is measured. Your base training starts a lot earlier now. You're expected to be fitter a lot earlier now as well, and it's just the season seems to get a bit longer every year.
So effectively now these guys are just sort of professional cyclists all the time, and so the old school way of looking at training and then periodization and so forth is a little less important?
No, it's still very important, because like I said earlier, you have 25 to 30 guys, so each person on the team is tasked to be good at a different part of the year. Now that said, though, everybody is still required to go to all the training camps. Like for instance, most of the teams are having training camps now in November, which is all team photos, measuring of bikes, bike positioning, all your health checks are done in November, where you're not really required to be riding that much. And then December, January, they'll have 2 more camps, December and January, where the riding, the base mile becomes much more important.
So cycling, has been described as pretty much an aerobic sport, but one of the things that I find most interesting about it is that it really combines both anaerobic and sort of muscular strength with an extreme amount of aerobic conditioning. So tell me a little bit about what's the actual conditioning that occurs that a cyclist goes through in the build up to the races. I mean, what precisely is he doing in the base build, and then, as you would call it, putting the heat on it later on? I mean, what does all that mean?
Well, basically constantly measuring your power to weight. How much power can you push and how much do you weigh? So the less that you weigh and the more power you can push, the faster you go up the mountains. Or the more power you have, if you happen to be a sprinter and you can hold the peak power for 10 to 15 seconds, then you're expected to train those muscles as well. So everybody's, like anything, is good at whatever their specialty is, but the training is all pretty much the same, where it's lots of miles and be able to do your peak power for a sprint or for a hill climb after 4 to 5 hours. So obviously you have to get all the miles in, you have to get all the endurance training in, And then you have to really work on those specific power training and always trying to increase your threshold wattage.
So, for example, in your wattage during the tour, what was sort of the peak running, you know, full performance threshold, or FTP, if you will, if you think about it that way?
So my sprints, if I was in good sprinting shape, it'd be about 1,450 watts. And then my climbing, so my 20 to 30 minute power would be about 450 watts. So it's kind of hard, unless you actually ride a bike and you do wattage training, it's hard to understand what that is, but it does require a lot of training and a lot of focusing on your diet. Every little bit counts at that level, and you know, the riders are obsessed with their weight and their diet and everything that goes into their body.
For context, mine are exactly 50% of those numbers, right? Which I'm quite proud of, incidentally, but nevertheless, half the power.
Mine are probably around there now as well, since I'm not racing anymore.
Yeah. All right, so you know, I you know, all the other pro riders that I know, I mean, I have a sort of idea of how many miles they ride per year, but how many miles would you ride a year, do you think?
We'll do
Just
about,
in training and everything else.
yeah, probably about 20,000 miles.
20,000
Just
miles
over
a year.
30,000 kilometers.
And then how many races per annum on average, like a range?
I would do less than most, because
Yeah.
I had a really good schedule where I was able to spend more time at home. So I would do about 60 to 70 races a year, but a lot of the riders do 90 to 100.
Wow, now they do 90, okay. All right. And presumably you are retired?
Yes, retired.
And when,
From racing.
When did you retire?
2012.
And so how much do you ride now?
Well, you know, we ride a lot together now. I ride 2 to 4 hours, 4 days a week, let's just say, on average.
Yeah. Incidentally, so I'm at the office this morning, and I have this training system that I use and that George uses also. And before he's to get on the plane to come up here, he's on the training side. I can see that he's on the train.
Yeah, got a good 30 minutes in this morning.
Yeah.
That was about it. I needed a sweat.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the aerobic training that we just talked about, how would you characterize cycling as distinct from other endurance sports, say, for example, triathlons, marathons, and what have you? I mean, to me, it's obviously the case that in cycling you have a full range of sort of physiologic output, whether it's, you know, just regular endurance, riding forever, just bring the input in and keep hydrated, or, you know, but we have zones 5, 6, and 7, and what have you. I mean, how do you think about that relative to other sports?
Well, I don't spend much time thinking about other sports, but I do know that cycling is not only all about power. I mean, positioning in the peloton is just as important many times as power. You can have somebody who's got off the charts power to weight numbers, but if he's not able to be efficient in the peloton, then in Europe it's impossible for him to be successful. Where marathons and triathlon is, I would say, arguably as hard as cycling, but you don't have that sort of positioning aspect where it's kind of like a chess game where you're like, well, if I need to be in the wind right here, I'm wasting energy, but I also need to get 10 spots further up the road, or I'm not going to enter this section in the size of this platform here in the first 10 guys, and then I may never see the front again. So there's always constantly your sense of awareness in the peloton is very, very important, which I think the other sports, albeit are very difficult in their own right, they don't have that, you know, the 250 people battling for position.
So that's interesting, and if you were a non-cyclist, that's probably not something that is readily apparent what all of that means, because I mean, I learned this riding with you guys also. It's like, you know, when he says, if I don't see the brake and I'm not in the brake and I'm not drafting appropriately and I get dropped, it's physiologically out of the cards that I'm going to catch them again, and the race is over, right? It's just not going to happen, right? So the sort of, and I think a lot of people that look at professional cycling, I know for myself, I didn't know what it looked like. I didn't know what it meant to see somebody. The first cycling event I ever paid attention to was Mara Abbott's Rio ride 2 years ago, right? And it didn't make any sense why she couldn't win.
Why she got caught with 500 meters to go.
She was out on her own, out in the front, and three girls were working behind them, and I didn't understand what that meant.
Yeah.
Now I do.
Now you do.
It's really, really important to be strategic about it. Can you describe that video that we just saw? And for anyone that's interested, that was a trailer to a DVD called Chasing Legends, in which it's about the 2009 Tour de France. There are numerous other videos out there and books galore, because this is a sport that's been around for 110 years formally, and they run the same races every year, right? But anybody that wants to see that, so one of the things that I've always liked to try to convey to people who wonder why I ride bikes and why a guy like this could do it for 30 years at that level is, what actually happens in a race or in a peloton. So if you could, George, describe for me what it's like to be in a peloton in the last 25 kilometers of any sort of stage race. Because, things picking up pace, talk to me about how you train for that, how do you focus, and what's required in order to do that?
A lot of miles on the bike, a lot of bike handling skills, because the roads primarily in Europe where we're racing are all very small, very twisty, windy, lots of roundabouts, lots of road furniture that just kind of pops up in the middle of the road. So you can never, especially in the last 25 miles or 20 miles of a race, you can never really zone out and chat with your buddies. You have to be so focused. You have to be super aware of which way the wind is coming, which way your coaches are behind you in the car, constantly keeping you aware if there's a hill coming, if there's a downhill, if there's a dangerous corner, if the wind is going to be, you can be taking a right turn and the wind is going to be coming from the left or from the back. So you just have all this information coming at you.
So those guys are telling you this?
Yeah, they're telling you that most of the time. And it depends too, if you're finishing on a 20-mile mountain, then it's not very dangerous. You're going uphill and you're not going that fast. Now they're telling you how steep it is or if it's letting up. So it just depends on which day and where you're racing in the world. But it's usually fairly intense the last hour of every race.
So this one's a little more nuanced, but I've tried to think about the sense of doing that, and and I was never a professional, but being able to spend time with guys like you and to be in sort of these quasi races for this stuff. So, is the experience, what's the truly remarkable experience about cycling that you guys were always just so eager to replicate?
Winning is always
Winning was
very. It makes it all worth it. All the cycling is such a difficult, all-encompassing sport that your life is all about, how much you're training, how is what you're doing in your everyday life going to affect your next training ride or your next bike race, which is many times very self-centered. So when you're able to win these big races, then it makes it all worth it. Your family is happy, everybody's happy. But that doesn't come very often, so it keeps you working hard and it keeps you motivated.
Ask a couple more questions here, and then I want to open it up to, please, hopefully everybody can dive in here. You were also on a team with Lance Armstrong for a long time, and there was obviously some conflict and controversy around U.S. Postal Service and what have you. Do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions about it?
Sure, no problem.
So, these are issues relating to performance-enhancing drugs. Can you talk about this in relation to cycling's history and also your own experience in it?
Sure. Well, cycling, like many other sports, has had a problem with performance-enhancing drugs, or had a problem. I believe it's better now, but for 100 years. Some of the past Tour de France winners tested positive for amphetamines. One of the Tour de France winners died of amphetamines and has a monument on Mount Ventoux of them. So it's been a problem for a long time. And unfortunately, Lance and I were in like the smack highlight or the peak of that era. And we came to a point where, we either did it or we went home and chose another path. So it was very rife in the peloton, and it was one of those things where we went from winning, world championships, we were the best riders in the world, to 1 year not being able to stay with the worst riders in the peloton. So it was a really tough choice. I hated that I was part of that era, but at the same time, it was good that I was part of it, because I was able to remain in the sport and help change the sport and see the change myself, which a lot of people in the press will never really want to admit, that the sport has actually changed, and that, back then it was maybe 90% of the people were doping, 10% weren't. Now it's 10% are doping, 90% is not doping, and it's not part of the culture anymore. And cycling is leading the way in terms of testing and the at-home testing, the ATOM system, where you have to give an hour You have to give it an hour period in every 24 hours of your life exactly where you're going to be so they can test you. And I think we're one of the only sports that does that.
And they also have what's the blueprint situation or the biological?
Or the biological passport where you have to get blood testing quarterly so they can measure your blood values. They know exactly what your natural state of your blood values are, and if they see a spike in any way, they'll flag you for it.
Yeah, so, as sort of a amateur cyclist and being involved in it and interested in it, I've always had sort of my own opinions about it. And and the more I studied the sport and learned the sport, and then met people like you and other professionals, it seemed as though I don't want to make light of it, but it had been the case that at least my read on the whole situation there were periods of time where pretty much everybody was doing one form or another of this sort of situation.
And now people only know it about it as the Lance problem, but it happened way before he ever did. He didn't start it.
Yep.
He didn't finish it. He just was very successful during that period, and he got blamed for a lot of it.
Yeah. Did it really make, at the end of the day, do you think that the PEDs make that appreciable a difference? I mean, a person using PEDs versus one not using them, all things being equal?
At the time, yeah, for sure. I mean, if you weren't doing it then, you weren't able to compete.
Just couldn't
compete. Now, in many ways, the sport has evolved so much, and technology has gotten playing so much bigger part in the sport of cycling that in many ways you can mimic doping without actually doping. I mean, the top riders spend 10 days a month at altitude. They know exactly what their blood values are. They know they have the lightest, fastest equipment. They know what kind of fabric they need to wear to be the most aerodynamic. So they're able to. The times are as fast or faster than the doping days because the technology has improved that much.
Wow.
Nutrition. I mean, every calorie they put into their body is measured. They have certain time periods where they cannot eat certain things. They have to wait a certain amount of time before they can have a protein or a carb after a ride. Everything is completely calculated to get the most out of the rider.
One final question. How does, like in terms of your conditioning going into the Tour de France, what body fat percentage would you have going into the Tour, and what would you have coming out of it?
I would go in pretty lean, 5%, and you would eat so much during the Tour that I wouldn't lose weight. I would remain as is, because you eat as much as you possibly can. Yeah.
All right. That's all for me. Who would like to ask some questions of any race? Yes?
Can you say something about the biggest technical, in terms of the bikes themselves, the biggest technical changes you saw over the course of your career?
The material. I mean, we started racing with steel, and then we went to aluminum. Now everybody's on carbon, and the carbon every year is getting lighter and more and stronger. In fact, it's gotten so much lighter and stronger that the UCI has implemented a 16-pound limit. Like if the bikes are under 16 pounds, you'll see riders, they'll get weight at the start, and if they're too light, they'll tape like a screwdriver to the bottom of the frame to get it over the 16-pound limit. So the weight has come down tremendously.
Yes.
Alpe d'Huez is always hyped as sort of the most challenging climb, but in your opinion, is that the most challenging?
No, Alpe d'Huez is probably the most historical, important climb, and it probably has the most people. People from all over Europe come and they set up their corners, like the Dutch corner, the Danish corner. It's a massive party. So in that sense, it's probably the most popular. But I would say my most dreadful climb is either Mount Ventoux or the Tourmalet. Those are very exposed, very steep, difficult climbs.
Another question, if I may. Could you just give us like a 3-minute sort of strategy, what it's like, in terms of the team? Because it's a team sport. It's not good for themselves, but how, you always hear about he's helping them up the mountain. It's like, you can't help, the person's not, you're not pulling on. So how does that look? How do you help somebody, or how does somebody help you?
Yeah.
It matters his positioning, but in terms of getting them,
Well, so cycling is all about conserving energy throughout a 6-hour day. So in my position, it would be many times I'd have to keep Lance out of the wind. I'd have to move them up when I knew there were small roads coming. And on a climb, even though you're not really helping that much, you can still pace your leader. You can still kind of keep him out of the wind if it's a headwind. Positioning, like I said, is very important. Bringing him water when he needs it. I mean, just the little simple things that would cost energy if you were trying to get your own water bottles, or if you were trying to stay in the wind yourself. Then you're losing that 1%, which at that level could be win or lose.
Are you familiar with cyclist Brian Fogel's documentary Icarus?
Yeah.
Would you say that, I guess you as an insider, would say that was accurate to the whole doping epidemic?
Well, so the movie started out as a cycling kind of doping movie.
Yeah.
It was kind of, in my opinion, a bit boring at first, but it was interesting in the sense that he started doping and he did worse. I don't know if you caught that, but he fell down, he crashed, he got sick, which, to answer a bit of Alan's question, there's a lot more than just especially in those days, than doping making you successful. You still had to stay upright, you still had to stay healthy, you still had to take care of your body, and he did worse the next year. But he's a really interesting guy. I had dinner with him in Aspen this summer, and he basically just stumbled upon this Russian guy to help him with the cycling thing, and this whole other story happened, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. The Russian Federation is back in the Olympics, and then Lance and all these people are still banned for life. And so something happened there where money played a big factor in it, but it's kind of an interesting turn of events there.
How important is like altitude training?
Very important. It's everything now. All the top riders, they're at altitude 10 days a month now. Basically, they go to altitude at least 10 days every 2 months, and it's like I said earlier, it mimics doping. People would take EPO before to increase their red blood cells. Now they go to altitude and do the same thing.
Meaning maybe 2,000 to 4,000 meters.
Yeah, there's a sweet spot just above 2,000 meters. A lot of them go to Tenerife, the Spanish island, or Colorado, but Colorado is a bit too far away from the races, and it's too cold in the winter, so they don't go there as much.
Yeah, I got a solicitation today to go to a training camp in I guess it was someplace in Spain, an altitude training camp, just by a professional team. But it actually, you go and live at altitude, and your hematocrit numbers will change.
Yep.
So the issue is that when they have the passports, I guess they have to justify how they.
Yeah, they can say that they were at altitude, but also not everybody reacts the same to altitude. I mean, some riders go to altitude and they don't recover well, they don't sleep well, and their training gets affected, and they end up doing worse. So the top riders that go have had experience going, and they've been successful at going, but it's not like everybody gets the same effect from altitude training.
Is your training like all year round, or when you were training, like is it always intense, or is it a build up to?
It's definitely a build up. I mean, you'd take time off after the season. I would usually take a month off, where I would just do very light activity or some other sports just to do something. But I would, to me, mentally, it was important to have like a month break from the sport that you're doing, just to kind of rebuild the motivation and sort of heal all the injuries that you had throughout the year. But it's really important to just kind of take a break from it. I think it always help keep me personally motivated and hungry to get back going again.
I remember that 5-second loss for you, and I'm just wondering, I know winning isn't everything personally, but pretty close. What would you consider your best moment or your best race?
Honestly, I would say either winning the national championships in my hometown, just because I had friends and family that knew that I was a professional cyclist racing in Europe, but they never got to see firsthand what I did. So then the pro national championships came to my hometown, and I won it the first year, and then I won it 2 years later. And those are always very special because I have all my friends that have never been to any races, and family that have a hard time getting to all the races, and they were all there and they all got to see it.
With regard to your pro continental team right now, first of all, what do you consider yourself, like coach, manager, purveyor?
I'm the general manager, and I try to help raise as much money for the team. I help hire riders, I help get the team into races. I don't travel with the team that much. I only go to a few races, but I'm always quite aware and up to date on the day-to-day activities of the team.
Sorry for the follow-up. Just what's the next best thing that can be achieved with that team?
Well, the goal is to get it to be a pro tour team racing in Europe full-time, racing the Tour de France, being one of America's top teams. That's my goal for it.
How do you guys train to break your body limit? For example, you mentioned your peak power is 1400 to 1500, and I think for me it's only 600 to 700.
So you just got to do a lot of intervals if you're trying to work on your sprint, you got to do a lot of sprint intervals. If you're trying to work on your climbing numbers, you got to do a lot of climbing intervals. But like I recommended to Alan, hire a good coach to get you some good workouts and measure your performance and measure your improvement. That's the only way to get better.
George is not a coach. George is if you ask him what to do, he just tells you what he just said, right? So we'll just do some sprints, right?
Yeah, we need a coach up here to tell you
and that's
exactly.
why he said, Alan, you need a coach.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I understand your ancestry is at least half Colombian.
Yep.
Do you speak Spanish with your dad and then you raised much in South America?
Yeah, we speak Spanish at home. Well, I did growing up. And he lives right next door to me now, so we still speak Spanish to each other. And no, I did not. That's one of my biggest regrets is not riding more in Medellin, just because the riding there is incredible. I went and rode there this past November, and it was amazing. We did like a 40-mile ride, and we had 6,000 feet of climbing. It's a great, just tons of great cyclists there. It's at altitude. And Medellin it's called the land of the eternal spring. It's 75, 80 degrees all year long. So I regretted not going there to train when I was racing, because it would have been perfect.
Yes.
One of the unique things with the tour is the day after day grind of it. So you've ridden for 5.5 hours, now you have 18 hours till you ride again. What does that 18 hours look like? What are you doing to get your body back in shape?
So I always say the tour is like, even though it's 3 weeks long, 21 days of 5 to 6 hours a day, it goes by so quick because your days are only 6 hours long. Like the days are 6 hours long and the time the race goes on. The time in between is so precious. Like you finish the race, you have like an hour to 3 hour drive to the hotel, depending on where you are. You eat in the bus, you try to stretch in the bus, everybody's got showers, you shower in the bus, you eat a little bit, you get to the hotel, you eat again, you get a massage, then you go to the chiropractor or the osteopath. Then you do, like now they have all these recovery devices, whether they're space boots, they're compression boots, or you take an ice bath. It's all about recovery and eating, and then going to bed.
How many calories are you eating a day?
Well, I never really measured my calories, but it would be a lot. I mean, 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day.
Talk a lot about how marginal cycling is now, like how precise you have to be to win. Do you think there's like a peak to how fast you can go, or do you think we're reaching that peak?
That's a good question. I mean, the times are still getting faster. The technology is improving. The bikes are getting lighter. Wheels are getting faster. So I think we're close. We're not going to see these huge jumps that we've seen. But I think the riders and the teams are getting smarter. Now you see Sky is like they count every little thing that happens on the team, and the teams are all starting to follow that sort of protocol. So the group in general is getting faster.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your retirement and what it was like going from your peak physical condition to not having races planned. Like psychologically, physically, what was that like?
Well, I jumped into co-running my company with my brother, so I stayed sort of, I stayed challenged that way, and I still ride all the time, not nearly as much as I used to. I pick like one event a year where I have to get kind of fit for. Like the last 2 years I've done Cape Epic, I've done a lot of Gran Fondos and a lot of events where even though I'm not that competitive anymore, I still don't want to get dropped, or I still don't want to be not in the first group. Sometimes I don't end up in the first group. It is by choice. I prefer to like ride with my friends, but like I want to be able to be there if I need to be there. So I ride enough where I feel like I have a good balance where I can still work and be fit enough on the bike to ride with whomever I want.
Two questions. One, the Tour de California, that's kind of been an event in the U.S. that's on TV. Like, where does that rank kind of in the? Is that an up and coming race? I mean, who's coming to it? And then where's your favorite place to ride in the States?
So the Tour of California is very important for the U.S. riders and the U.S. market. The European guys, they come, they still want to win because it's a 2.1 race now, so it's still important in terms of points. But in terms of historically in cycling, it's not nearly as big as like the Tour of Flanders or the Tour de France. But nowadays, every race is so hard and it's so hard to win that it's still an important part of for sure the American team's calendar. And some of the European teams, if they happen to have an American sponsor or they have an American potential sponsor, they'll take it quite serious. And my favorite place to ride in the U.S. is good old South Carolina. Love it there.
Okay.
And I gotta go.
Go ahead.
In the back.
George, I've always been intrigued about the breakaway and the longer races like the Tour de France, the early breakaways, most of which don't succeed. And when you have people that aren't going to be a threat to DC, what's the strategic value of attempting a break, especially the ones that start right off the get-go?
Yeah.
For the team, if they know they're not gonna, and they always get swallowed up. I mean, it's great entertainment. But
Simple question, TV time. It's one of the most viewed sporting events in the world, and for a sponsor to have their jersey, their name in front of the TV for 2 to 4 hours is still quite important, and that's primarily why most of the teams do it. They'll have designated riders to get out there and do it. But in the rare occurrence that sometimes it works as well, so they still got to try.
All right. George came out for the day. He's flying back tonight. And as an everyone, thank you a lot for coming.
Thank you.
here.
Thanks everybody for coming out.